Job bemoans his sad condition, but then strongly asserts his innocence. He lists sin after sin after sin and insists, I have not done this. In fact, I did the opposite. Let's open the book and think on these things. I am Nathan C. Johnson, Bible teacher. I greet you in the faith and fellowship of our great God and Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ, whose we are, whom we love, and whom we serve. Let's open our Bibles and look today at Job chapter 30. Remember that Job, after ignoring Zophar's rude interruption, is going on to make his closing statement and argument, corresponding with his introduction regarding his misery in Job chapter 3. So Job first remembered his past prosperity, how great respect he was held in, how great his wealth was. God favored him, his children were there, people respected to and looked up to him, he was a great leader. And yet now he's in such a miserable condition that even the lowest of the low, the outcasts, the people nobody else wants, laugh at Job and say, at least I'm not as bad as Job. But we continue Job's conclusion and his miserable condition, his description of it in Job 30 and verse 15. And again, I'm reading from Bullinger's excellent translation of Job. All now is overthrown, and like the wind, terrors my dignity have scattered far, and gone like clouds is my prosperity. So Job says, all that I had before is now overthrown. It is scattered, it is dissipated. He says it's overthrown like the wind. But wind there is the Hebrew ruach, the word that's often translated spirit, and yet it can also mean the wind. Now, interestingly, the King James here has, terrors are turned upon me, they pursue my soul as the wind. And yet this is an odd case where the King James has put the word soul, but it is not the Hebrew word nephesh, the typical word for soul in the Bible. It's the Hebrew nedabach, which means dignity, or as Bullinger makes it, nobility. Terrors my nobility have scattered far. So it has nothing to do with the soul. And gone like the clouds is my prosperity. My prosperity is gone like a cloud when it breaks up and dissipates. Verse 16, and now my soul within me is poured out. The days of my affliction hold me fast. So his soul is poured out. And here we have nephesh. And the King James translators, as if they can make it any more confusing, have translated a different word as soul in verse 15 and then translated the word that actually means soul in verse 16. So certainly they haven't helped anything here. Now soul can mean the life, or it can mean the desires, the emotions and desires, now the things that fulfill those desires, the comfortable life, your comfortable life, and the comforts that give you a comfortable life. So his emotions, his comforts, everything is gone. He says it's poured out like water. And once you pour out water on the ground, it's gone, it's lost, it soaks in and is gone. He says, the days of my affliction hold me fast. I'm stuck in this affliction. I can't get out, I'm held fast. There's no escape. Verse 17, by night my bones are pierced with pains without. My throbbing nerves within me never rest. So he describes his terrible illness here. And that at night his bones are pierced with pains without. And my inner being is just, there's so much pain at night. And then my throbbing nerves within me never rest. And my nerves constantly with pains are throbbing and there's no rest. There was no relief from it. Of course, this was Satan making sure Job had not a moment of rest. Verse 18, by great exertion is my garment changed. It girds me as my tunic girds my neck. So it's hard for him to change his clothes. Why is it hard for Job to change his clothes? Well, remember he has these oozing running sores. And these sores probably run, and then what they ran dries, and it dries on the clothes, and they stick to his skin. Well, not to mention they're terrible, these sores. So when he's trying to pull these clothes off and they're dried on, it's just terrible. It's awful. Changing his clothes is a horrifying ordeal. He says, they cause my clothes to stick to my body. Or it could be his body is so swollen, perhaps. He says, they gird me like my tunic girds my neck. So like my collar. Hebrew, it's literally the mouth of his coat. Poetic description of a collar. Just like my collar is tight, so my clothes are tight on me when I try to get them off. Verse 19, into the mire his hand hath cast me down. To dust and ashes I may be compared. So his hand, he's assuming again that it's God doing all this to him. He sees the hand of Satan harming him and thinks it's the hand of God. But he's cast me down into the mire. Get down there, Job, into the filth. He says I can be compared to dust and ashes. Dust there again is soil, like the topsoil. God made man of the dust of the ground, Genesis 2:7. So he says, to dust, to soil, and to ashes I can be compared. I'm practically dead already. Verse 20, I cry aloud to thee, thou answerest not. I stand in prayer, but thou dost not regard. So it's not that he has not sought God in all this. We might say, well, Job just depended on his own strength and didn't seek God. Well, no, that's not how it was. He did seek God. He cried out to God. He prayed. He said, God, spare me from all this. He said, God didn't listen. It's not that I didn't pray, but God didn't listen. Verse 21, thou art become relentless to my prayer, and dost assail me with thy mighty hand. So he says, as far as my prayer is concerned, God, you are relentless. You won't hear it. You just won't hear it. And you won't let up. You just attack me with your mighty hand. The hand being the symbol of strength and skill. With all your skill, you assail me. So again, Job is blaming all that has happened to him on God, just like all his friends blamed everything that happened to him on God. And he has no concept that Satan has anything to do with this. The only difference between him and his friends is his friends insist, God did this to you, so therefore you must have deserved it. Job says, well, yeah, God did it to me, but I didn't deserve it, so what's wrong with God? Verse 22, thou usest to uplift me on the wind. Yea, thou didst cause me thereupon to ride. But now my substance thou dost bring to naught. He said, you used to uplift me on the wind, but wind there is again ruach, or spirit. Your spirit uplifted me, he said, it used to be. Yea, thou didst cause me thereupon to ride. I rode on your spirit. Your spirit would take me everywhere. Your spirit was my constant help. I would fly, I would soar with your spirit. Soar on the wings of your wind. He says, but now my substance thou dost bring to naught. Now you've just destroyed everything I have. Instead of bearing me up on your spirit, you've crushed me, along with everything I owned. Verse 23, I know that thou wilt turn me o'er to death, even to the place ordained for all who live. So he anticipates the only thing left for you to do, God, is kill me. I know that that's going to be the conclusion of all this torment. Once you're finally sick of bringing all this misery upon me, you'll kill me, and that'll be the end. He knows, as God says, that it's appointed to man once to die. He says, I'm going to the place ordained for all who live. Of course, there are plenty of people today who don't know that. But Job knows it. I'm going to death. That's ordained for all. Verse 24, prayer for these is vain. He will not help. The one in trouble, they may cry to him. So he says to pray for those who are ordained to death is to pray in vain. We say, is it really? Well, try praying not to die. Dear God, please help me never die. You can pray till you're blue in the face. Is it going to help? Well, no. Now, all are going to die eventually. Now, of course, this is recognizing what the Apostle Paul revealed, and that those who happen to be alive when the great resurrection into the kingdom takes place, why they won't die, they'll just instantly transfer from their fallen body into their glorious body of the kingdom. But that is the exception that proves the rule. Everyone else dies. And so just try praying to be the one exception and never die. Well, lots of luck with that. It's no use. It's no use. And of course, Job didn't know what Paul revealed yet. Regardless, the kingdom wasn't coming anywhere close to his lifetime anyway. Verse 25. Did not I weep for him whose lot was hard? Was I not for the helpless sorely grieved? So he insists, he says, when I saw someone with a hard lot, I wept. I wasn't hard and calloused. I wasn't like you friends mocking someone who has a hard lot. I was sorely grieved for the helpless. Now, him that was in trouble, as the King James puts it, that is, who has a hard time. Bullinger makes it his lot is hard. And then the I here was I not for the helpless sorely grieved is actually in Hebrew was not my soul, my nephesh sorely grieved. And your nephesh again has to do with your emotions and desires. So weren't my emotions grieved at the hard lot of some? Verse 26, yet when I looked for good, then evil came, and darkness deep when I expected light. He said, I thought for all the good I had done that I would get good. I thought for all the compassion I'd had on those with a hard lot that I would have a good lot. But instead I got calamity. I thought my righteousness would bring me light, but instead I only got darkness. So Job is puzzled. Why didn't his righteous ways result in good for him like both he and his friends had assumed it would? Yes, Job had thought just like his friends until this calamity happened to him. He thought, my righteous ways will lead me to a happy life. Just like his friends thought. But now his righteous ways didn't, and he doesn't understand it. Verse 27, my bowels boil, and they are never still. So suddenly has trouble come on me. So bowels. Now bowels are thought of as the seat of your emotions, your viscera, your inner organs. And think of what happens to like your stomach and your digestive system when you're very emotional, very upset about something. You can see why they thought emotions came from there. Because whenever you got emotional, that just would tighten up and get all upset in your digestive system. So his bowels boil and are never still. His emotions are all upset, and probably, of course, everything that happened to him really, literally had upset his digestive system, no doubt. Yeah, he's had no time to get used to all this, so suddenly has trouble come on me. It didn't come slowly. It wasn't a long, slow, gradual fall. It was just, I was up in prosperity, and then boom, I was down in the depths. Verse 28, shrouded in gloom I go without the sun. I rose in the assembly and cried, help! So everywhere he goes, he's shrouded with gloom. You know, like those cartoons where they show someone who's always gloomy. It's like there's a cloud floating over the head and a little lightning striking. You know, he's like, everywhere I go, gloom follows me. And so what does he say? He says, I rose in the assembly. That is the Hebrew kahel. The kahel is the group of representatives, the called opposition ones. Job was an opposition one. He was a great king, a great chief among them, like he said. So he said, I went to the kahel and stood up and said, help. But it did no good. God wouldn't hear me. And what can my fellow kahel members do for me? 29, brother am I become to howling brutes, and a companion to the screeching birds. Now Bullinger makes it howling brutes. The King James Version says, I am a brother to dragons. And this is the Hebrew word tanin. Now it does certainly seem to be used for dragons. Or to use our modern word coined by the evolutionists to try to separate them from dragons, dinosaurs. Well, what's a dinosaur, a terrible lizard? What was a dragon, a terrible lizard? What's the difference? I mean, it's so silly. You know, of course they wanted to make it so that they lived millions of years ago and no human ever saw one. Even though plenty of humans saw dragons and they lived with us, and I think some of them are probably still alive. But he says, I become a brother to tanin. Now it's not just dinosaurs. Tanin could also be a monstrous snake or great whales, so forth. We might also say it means monsters. And a companion to the screeching birds. Well, the King James makes it owls. who knows what bird it is, could perhaps be the pterodactyls. Verse 30, without, my skin is all burnt up and black. Within, my bones are all consumed with heat. So again, describing his terrible illness. His skin is like it's been burnt black. And then under his skin, his bones are consumed with heat. He's just so inflamed with his illness. Verse 31, therefore my harp to mourning has been turned. My lyre is like the voice of them that weep. So he says, it's because of all this that I mourn like this. Any cheerful music, my former cheerful music has all become dirges. Well, no wonder, considering what's happened to him, what's going on in his life. So that is the just miserable situation he's in. But now Job is going to make his final conclusive argument regarding his innocence and that he did not deserve what came upon him. Verse 31, a covenant mine eyes had made with God, how then could I upon a virgin gaze? So Job says, I made a covenant, I cut a covenant. That was the common Hebrew way of putting it. You cut a covenant. We have the expression cutting a contract. But they literally would often take an animal sacrifice, cut it into pieces, and the two people entering into the covenant would walk between the pieces. And that would indicate we're both in the agreement. It's almost like if I fail to keep this agreement, may I die like this sacrifice has. But they would speak of cutting a covenant. So he says, I cut a covenant with my eyes, meaning with God regarding his eyes. And what was the covenant? Not to cast his eyes lustfully on a virgin. Well, that is a very good covenant to make. And I wish a lot of God's men today would make the covenant not to look at pornography. That certainly would be a very good covenant to cut with your God regarding your eyes. Verse 2, what would my judgment be from God above? Or what my lot from Shaddai in the height? So he says, if I was this type of man, I was constantly lusting after the young girls. What would Eloah, the venerable God, what would he judge regarding me? What would Shaddai, the bountiful God, think my lot should be as he looks on me from high, if he sees me lusting after every young woman who comes my way? Verse 3, is not calamity for evil men? To those who sin is not disaster due? He says, calamity and disaster ought to come on wicked men who are lawless. If I was a wicked and lawless man lusting after young girls, well, then I would deserve all this. Verse 4, would not Eloah see my evil way? Would he not take account of all my steps? He says, if I had done this, wouldn't Eloah, the God worthy of worship, have seen it and taken account of it? He said, certainly he would have, and then I couldn't say I don't deserve this, but I don't deserve this. I cut this covenant with my eyes. I never looked lustfully at the young women, the virgins. Verse 4, if I have walked in ways of falsity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit. So he says, if I was a deceiver, if I was false, if I was deceitful in my business dealings, my dealings with others. Verse 6, then let him weigh me in just balances, and let Eloah know my blamelessness. So he says, if Eloah, the venerable God, would truly judge me, weigh me in just balances, why, he would see this is not so. I was not false. I was not deceitful. I did not deceive others in my dealings with him. He says, just let him judge justly, and they'll see this. Verse 7, if from the way my step aside hath swerved, and if I have coveted what I had seen, or any stain has cleaved unto my hands. So he says, if I swerve from the right way, by coveting what I saw. So in other words, if he was dishonest. Now coveting. Sometimes we think that just means seeing an advertisement and saying, I want that. We covet things. Well, no, that's materialism. But see, coveting is wanting what someone else has that you have no right to have. I've said that coveting isn't looking at some other man's beautiful wife and saying, I would like a beautiful wife like he has. No, it's saying, I would like that man's beautiful wife. It's not looking at someone's wonderful, glorious mansion, beautiful house and saying, I want a beautiful house like that someday. It's saying, no, I want that person's beautiful house. I want that person's children. I want that person's car. I want that person's things. And of course, that can lead to adultery and to stealing and who knows what. Trying to get your hands on what rightfully belongs to someone else. That's coveting. He says, or any stain is clean to my hand. If I had stained my hands by getting what by right belonged to others, in other words. Verse 8, then let me sow and let another reap, and let my plantings all be rooted up. He says, if that's the case, then I would deserve others to steal what I had planted, to take my crops so I couldn't enjoy them. But of course, he did not. He did not covet what others had, and he did not stain his hands trying to get it. Verse 9, by woman if my heart have been enticed, and at my neighbor's door I have laid wait. So he already spoke of desiring a virgin, a young girl. Now he speaks of desiring a woman, another man's wife. And women, of course, were rarely, almost never, unmarried at the time. So an older woman would be another man's wife. He says, if another man's wife enticed me, if I laid wait at my neighbor's door for him to be gone so I could take his wife, commit adultery with her. Now the Hebrew is the word for woman, but Hebrew had no separate word for wife. Isha, the same word for woman, was the word for wife. Another man's woman is another man's wife. Well, he said, if I did that, well, then of course I would deserve what happened to me. Verse 10, then let my wife grind for another man. Let others humble her as if their slave. So if he says that was the case, then I would deserve my woman, my Isha, my wife, to abandon me and go to another man, since I had thought to take another man's woman. Now this is interesting. Last we heard from Job's wife, she said, why do you maintain your integrity? Curse God and die. Well, did she then turn around and go off with some other man? Is that what Job means? I would deserve this if I had gone to another woman? Now, what does it mean? Let her grind for another man. Well, grinding was women's work, grinding up the grain. That was something women did. That was part of the division of labor. That was their job. It was the most important task for a wife to do. Then let others humble her as if they're slave. King James translated it, bow down upon her, as if other men were committing adultery with her. Well, maybe they were. Like I said, I don't know what happened to Job's wife. He almost seems to imply that this is what has happened. He says, I would deserve this if I had taken another man's wife. Verse 11, for such a deed would be a heinous sin, a sin that must be brought before the judge. He says it would be a most heinous sin to take another man's wife. And that would deserve punishment before a judicial inquiry. Now, this is not the word for a judge from the book of Judges. In the book of Judges, you see that a judge is someone who determines what's right, what the order should be, and then sets things in order. But this is not that word. This means a judicial inquiry. He says, if I would take another man's wife, I would deserve a judicial inquiry for my deeds. Because that would be a heinous crime. Verse 12, a fire would be that to Abaddon burns, destroying all my increase at the root. So Abaddon, again, that means destruction. And this is not the first death, because, of course, our first death, we die with resurrection in view. Abaddon is the second death. And we know, indeed, the Scripture confirms that adultery is one of those crimes which could cause one to be sentenced to the second death. It is, indeed, a most heinous crime, and that there will be people who die the second death for the crime of adultery. He said, the righteous foundation of my wealth would sensibly deserve to be eroded away if indeed I had committed adultery. All my increase should be destroyed at the roots in that case. But, of course, he insists, I didn't commit adultery, so I don't deserve all my wealth being eroded. Verse 13, if I had spurned my servants' righteous cause, when they had brought before me their complaint. He says, if I was unjust with my servants, and they complained to me, and I didn't listen to them. Verse 14, what then could I have done when God rose up? When he required, could I have answered him? He says, if that was the case, what could I say then when El, the mighty God, the powerful God, rose up to destroy what I had? Well, he says, I could say nothing. I was unfair with my servants, so I deserve God to be unfair with me. But, he says, I was not that way. Verse 15, who in the womb made me, made he not him? And from one source gave being to us both? He says, I always looked at it that the Creator made us both in the womb. So since we both grew in woman's womb, why should I treat my servant as beneath me? Now this is very interesting that Job, in saying this, seems to anticipate the teaching of the Apostle Paul in the New Testament, where he commands masters to treat their slaves, particularly their believing slaves, but their slaves as brothers, as fellow believers, and as not beneath them at all. Well, Job says long before Paul made that command, he says that's how he treated the servants. He says, we're both born in the womb. We both came into this world naked with nothing. So, we both, of course, Paul says we both have an equal master in heaven. He's not going to favor one over the other. Job says that's how I always looked at it. And so I never treated my servants unjustly. Verse 16, if from the poor man's prayer I turned away, or if I caused the widow's eyes to fail. So he says, if the poor, the helpless, if I refuse to help them, oh, not my problem. I might be rich and privileged, but I deserve what I have and you don't, so forget it. Or the impoverished widow, when they looked to him for help. Remember what he said in 29, they rejoiced when he helped them. But he says if they looked to me for help and their eyes failed, they just waited and waited and help never came. Verse 17, or if I ate my morsel all alone, so that the fatherless ate none thereof. So he said, if I just sat and enjoyed my food, oh no, this is good. Meanwhile, the fatherless was sitting there starving and I just ignored him. My food, not my problem. And again, the fatherless were the protectorless. A father, a patriarch, everyone needed one. And the fatherless, having no patriarch, would be in trouble. Verse 18, but no, as with a father he grew up with me, and from my birth I guided her. He says, no, I was a father to the fatherless. Once I discovered their cause, they had a father. And he grew up as if from birth. An exaggeration from telling. He says, as if from birth, I guided the helpless woman, the helpless widow. He says, even when I was a child, I started doing such good works. Now, of course, not literally from birth, but he means from childhood. This exaggeration is telling. He says, this is how I've always been since childhood. I didn't have a misbegotten youth, and now I've done this lately. No, when I was young, I was just as compassionate. Verse 19, if e'er I saw one perishing with cold, or any needy without covering. So if he saw one freezing with cold, perish there is abad, related to Abaddon. Just he's needy, he doesn't have clothing. He doesn't have a covering, and it's cold, and he's freezing. Verse 20, have not his very loins blessed me indeed, when he has felt the warmth of my lamb's fleece? So he says his loins, almost like his private parts, they blessed me when they felt the warmth of the lamb's fleece. Now blessed there, the Hebrew barak, again, they spoke well of me as they felt the heat of the warm fleece that I provided to this poor, cold, suffering one. Verse 21, if against the orphan I have raised my hand, because I saw the judge would take my part. So he says, if I saw an orphan. Now, as I've said, a fatherless was basically protectorless and was helpless. A mother wasn't much protection. A woman needed a patriarch as well. But at least an orphan would have at least the fatherless would have a little help if he had a mother. An orphan wouldn't even have that much help. He says, if I raised my hand, if I brought my skill in against an orphan, because I saw the judge would take my part, well, I am the high and mighty ruler, so of course the judge is going to listen to me, not this helpless orphan. Well, that would be unjust, certainly. Verse 22, then let my shoulder from its socket fall, and let my arm be broken from its blade. And he says, curse me. May I be cursed if that was the case. I would deserve to lose all the power in my arm. I would deserve to have it broken. My strength. Now, of course, the arm stands for the strength. Young men, when they try to show their strength, they flex the muscles in their arms. He says, let all my strength be broken, as it has been. I would deserve it if I'd done this sort of thing. Verse 23, no, God's destruction ever was my dread. Before his majesty I could not stand. So he says, I always was afraid of destruction from El, the mighty God. I knew I couldn't stand before his majesty unless I was righteous, so I was righteous. I was always concerned with God looking on me. I never thought he wouldn't see. I never thought I could get away with being unjust. Verse 24, or if I put my confidence in gold, or to the fine gold said, thou art my trust. So he says, I could have trusted in my wealth. Oh, I don't need God, I have money. I don't need God, I have wealth and power. I trust in you, money, not in God. Verse 25, if I rejoiced because my wealth was great, because my hand had vast abundance gained. So if I rejoiced in this wealth, oh, this is really the most important thing to me, my money. This great gain I've gotten by my hand, by my skill. Verse 26, if on the sun I looked as it shone forth, or on the moon so bright as it marched on. He says, if I looked up and saw the heavenly bodies, the sun in its shining, the moon as it marched on in its brightness. Again, looking on these things for the idea of worshiping them. Verse 27, and secretly my heart hath been enticed, so that my hand in worship touched my mouth. So he says, if I was enticed by these heavenly bodies, I thought, wow, these things are great. A lot of people worship the sun and moon. Maybe I should too. Maybe when I see the sun, I should do a worshipful gesture, touch my mouth, as the sun worshipers do. Verse 28, this too had been a sin before the law, for then I had denied the God above. He says that would have been a sin too. Now notice this is his conclusion to both trusting in wealth and trusting in the sun and moon. And notice he makes trusting in your money equal with being an idolater. Is your trust truly in money, or is your trust truly in the sun and moon, or instead of in God? And I'd say there aren't a whole lot of people who worship the sun and moon in our society today, but there are a whole lot of people who sin by trusting in the wealth they've gathered rather than in God. So he says, that is to deny El, the mighty God above, if I trust in my money or if I trust in worshiping the sun and moon. These would be sins before the law, and yet, of course, he never did these things. Verse 29, or my foes' misfortune have I joyed, or exulted when ill came on him? When I saw my enemies and saw misfortune come upon them, did I rejoice? Oh, yes. Yes, oh, that piece of bleep. He deserved it. Thank goodness he finally got what had coming to him. Ha ha ha. I love it. Was that my attitude? Verse 30, nay, not my mouth would I permit to sin by asking for a curse upon his soul. He says, I wouldn't let myself rejoice when bad things happen to them, and I wouldn't let my mouth sin by asking for a curse on his soul. That's nephesh. And he says, even to curse my enemy would be a sin. I never did so much as wish ill to my enemies. Now, talk about a common thing, wishing ill to your enemies, and yet Job says, I never did it. Verse 31, though have not those of mine own household said, oh, that we had our foemen's flesh to eat, that we might satiate ourselves therewith. So, though have not those of mine own household said. So he seems to say, even those of my household haven't done this. Now, as common as such sentiments are, as far as Job knew, his household had learned not to wish evil against their enemies. Now we see here the exaggerated type of typical exaggerated cursing in the Middle East. Oh, that we had our foemen's flesh to eat, that we might satiate ourselves therewith. Well, this is the kind of thing people would say in society around Job. But Job wouldn't say such things, and he wouldn't allow his family members to say such things. Verse 32, the stranger never lodged outside my tent. My doors I opened to the traveler. So he says, I didn't ignore the foreigner when he was in need. The traveler, when he came by, I was always the perfect host, the picture of hospitality. I let them lodge with me. Verse 33, if I, like Adam, my transgression hid, and in my breast concealed my secret sin. So he said, if I was like Adam, what did Adam do? Well, when he sinned, what did he try to do? Well, first he tried to cover up his sin with fig leaves. Tried to cover it up. And then when God came to see him, he fled and hid. He tried to hide his sin. He said, if I did that, if I tried to hide my transgression like Adam did, if I concealed secret sin in my breast, if I hid it, hid the wrong I'd done. Verse 34, then let me tremble at the rabble crowd. Yea, let the scorn of men of rank affright, and let me silence keep and not go forth. So he says, then let this happen. Let me tremble at the rabble. And we already saw he does, verse 30. Or chapter 30, we saw he trembled at the rabble. He's basically saying, then I would deserve this. Yea, let the scorn of men of rank affright. He says, then I would deserve all the ranking men to scorn me like they do. Then I would keep silence, have nothing to say. I couldn't go forth. I couldn't argue like I'm arguing that I didn't deserve it. But I didn't do these things. So I do have a complaint to make. I do have something to say. I didn't hide a secret sin like Adam did. Verse 35. Oh, that I had but one to hear what I have noted down. Let Shaddai answer me, or let mine adversary write his charge. So he wishes for one to hear him, some impartial mediator, to hear him in his claim, and to listen and to examine the facts, because he's just certain that the facts would lead to his exoneration. Or he wishes if only Shaddai, the bountiful God, would answer me. If only he would stop being silent and just pouring out this trouble on me. Or if only my adversary would write up his charge. He's, of course, thinking his adversary is God. He doesn't realize his adversary is Satan. Of course, Satan's only charge against him was that he faithfully served Jehovah. And Satan hated that. But he thinks it's God, and he says, let him write down his charge so I know what it is. Verse 35, would I not on my shoulder lift it up, or bind it as a crown upon my head? So he says, I would lift it up on my shoulder. Every step I would bear the fact that I was righteous. And then he says I could bind it on my head like a crown. I could come like a prince before God justified. Well, he imagines this is how it would be. If I could actually face God, if Shaddai would actually speak up, well, then my righteousness would be proved, and I could stand like a prince before God. Well, that's not how it really happened, was it, when God finally revealed himself to Job? That's not what Job did or what he said or how it worked out in chapter 42, as we'll see. But again, Job is justifying himself here. Verse 37, the number of my steps I would declare. Yea, as a prince I would draw near to him. He says, I would be able to declare step by step by step how everything I've done has been righteous. And God would say, oh, yeah, you're right. Oh, okay. And then I'd draw near God like a prince. Verse 38, if all my land against me had cried out, and if its furrows altogether wept. So he says, if the land I'd used had cried out against me, and this is probably because it wasn't really his. If the furrows altogether wept, oh, for our original owner that Job stole us from. Verse 39, if without having paid I ate its fruits, and made the souls of those who owned it groan. He says, if I ate fruit from that land without payment, and I made the souls, meaning the emotions and the desires, of the true owners of that land. The Hebrew is Baal, the word that's often used for the Baal idols, and means a lord, a master idol. He says, if I made the masters of those lands groan, oh, for our land that Job stole. Verse 40, then thorns had thrived instead of wheat I'd sowed, and noxious weeds instead of barley grown. Job's words are ended, he will say no more. So he says, then I would deserve to have weeds rather than crops. Then I would deserve noxious weeds instead of barley. So it's almost like 35 through 37 were his conclusion, but then he thought of one more thing. Oh yeah, I forgot if I stole my land that I planted. So bring that into, I didn't do that either. But now he says, I think I've covered everything. I concluded my argument. I have nothing more to say. He says, I'm not going to, we aren't going to fourth round here, guys. I'm done. I declared my innocence. I'm done. There's nothing more you can say. There's nothing more I can say. I'm done. So in this conclusion, we can see he toots his horn so decisively that his friends just have no opportunity to answer. His conclusion is, in my own eyes, I'm righteous. And what could his friends say to that? And indeed, they had no answer. So Job's final address is concluded. He insists he has done nothing wrong, going point by point through all the possible sins and insisting on his own righteousness regarding all of them. He believes if he could plead his case before God, he would win. And God would recognize him as a prince of righteousness before him. He agrees, I ought to be cursed if I sinned, but insists, I have not sinned in any way. So thus his argument ends. And yet this does not end the discussion, because there is a fourth friend who hasn't spoke up yet, who's going to speak up now. And we'll consider that fourth friend in our next video. Thanks for watching. If you have liked this video, please press like below. Feel free to comment. Your comments help these videos get promoted. Thank you for watching. Until we meet again around the pages of God's book, I bid you goodbye.